Okay, so we're going to shift gears a bit now and talk about fundraising evaluation. I have two parts. When I talk about institutional integrity, there are two parts to it. There's fundraising evaluation, and then there's fundraising ethics. I'm going to hold off on talking about ethics until after the midterm. I'm going to focus right now, though, on the... Yeah?
Just simple student kind of question. Does it mean that we still have to read the text on ethics in the textbook or not?
There won't be any questions on the exam about ethics per se. You have the AFB Code of Ethics there, but I'm not talking about it before the midterm. I will be talking about it, but not before the midterm. So today I'm going to be talking simply about accountability in general, why it matters, and then specifics of how to evaluate fundraising activity. First, I talk about accountability. This is an article from 2011 from the Canadian Press. Yeah, from the Canadian Press. It talks about wages earned by people who work in the voluntary sector. So saying that goodwill means good wages for thousands of Canadian charity workers. An analysis of tax filings by the Canadian Press has found salaries often run well into 6 figures, raising questions about how money raised in the name of charity is being spent. The Canada Revenue Agency keeps a database of all the country's registered charities, which now number around 85,000. As I've shown you earlier, charities have to disclose their top 10 salaries. They said there are around 1 million charity workers in Canada. The agency's database shows more than 6,000 of them earned above $120,000 last year. And a few hundred made over $350,000. Now, what is this article trying to evoke in terms of a response from readers? How do they want readers to respond to this? Kind of outrage or uncomfortable. Yeah, some kind of outrage. How does this strike? How does this information strike you? Is it?
I knew about this information, so I'm not surprised.
Okay, not surprised.
Charity persistence is anyone that works in a nonprofit.
Sorry?
Anyone that works at a registered charity, for example, say hospitals, that would include doctors. And,
yeah, I mean, if you look at this reasonably and start thinking about it, I showed you the CRA report from McGill University, and you know that there are several people working at McGill who are in that category that they earn, up in the 350,000 plus range. But do you remember how much money McGill spends in a year? What the annual budget was? Yeah, it was a little over $1 billion. It was about $1.1 billion. Well, wouldn't you want the people running a $1.1 billion company to be the sorts of people who would deserve to be making at least $350,000? I mean, in the private sector, a $1 billion company, they would be considered cheap as hell if they were paying $350,000 to their chief executive officer. So clearly, there is some mixed messaging here. Here, by way of comparison, in the voluntary sector, according to the article, 0.6% of employees made $120,000 or more, and 1.2% earned between $80,000 and $120,000. Okay? That's in the voluntary sector, based on the research that the Canadian Press reported. In the general population, looking at Statistics Canada records, about 5.7% of Canadians earn more than $120,000. 5.7? That's more than 0.6. About 4.6% of the population earns between $80,000 and $120,000 versus 1.2% of people working in the voluntary sector. The reality is, basically, if you choose to work in the voluntary sector, you are effectively accepting to earn a lower salary than what you could be making in the private sector. And unfortunately, too many people on boards of directors think that that's how it should be. That somehow, if you're working for voluntary sector organizations, that you should be taking some kind of vow of poverty. You can tell I'm a little outraged by the suggestion that this is a problem. Here's another scandal. Charities, this is reporting from 2010. Canadian registered charities paid $762 million to third-party fundraisers. Well, here's some detail from that article. $8.2 billion was donated by Canadians to charities in 2009. $762 million was paid to private fundraisers. The article doesn't define what's meant by private fundraisers. And the amounts paid to fundraisers represent 9.3% of total funds raised. This was part of a nationwide investigative report that was done by the CBC with national level coverage and regional coverage happening all across the country. Here's part of the national coverage of that.
Canadians donate millions of dollars to charity every year. Now, a CBC News investigation has uncovered some startling details about where a lot of that money is going. Here's our senior investigative correspondent, Diana Swain, with details on who's been profiting from your goodwill.
Lauren Phillips feels lucky to have a healthy child. When the Children's Leukemia Research Association phoned asking for a donation, she wanted to give. But the caller's hard sell made her uneasy.
Hello? They didn't feel like a professional fundraising company or a charity. Something felt wrong.
She checked out the charity online, and what she found there shocked her. The caller was actually from a company hired by the charity to raise money on its behalf. CBC News called the donation line and asked how much the private company was keeping.
If I were to donate $100, how much goes to the charity? About 60?
40 to 50%.
We've learned it's actually much more than that. Records from the Canada Revenue Agency show that in 4 years, the charity has raised just over $4 million. But over $3 million of that, or about 75%, has gone to a private company hired to raise the money. Only $600,000 has actually gone to leukemia research.
I don't think it's ethical, personally, because you have people donating their hard-earned money to a charity they feel is worthwhile, and half of those dollars are not going to the charities.
But it's just one example we've found. The BC Wheelchair Sports Association kept only 13% of what it raised with an external fundraiser last year. The Saskatchewan Alzheimer's Society raised $95,000, but incredibly had to pay out $96,000. It actually lost money. For years, Nova Scotia Crime Stoppers has kept only about 20% of what its external fundraisers have brought in.
It's shocking. It's shocking.
Kate Bain works for a group that helps large donors decide which charities to support. She says high fundraising costs are a worrisome trend in Canada.
Less of what we give is going to charitable good works because more is being skimmed off in fundraising costs.
So how do charities themselves defend the costs? We tried to go to the Children's Leukemia Research Association's office in Niagara Falls, but the address turned out to be no more than a rented post office box. No one from the charity agreed to appear on camera.
When it comes to stopping high fundraising costs, that is in the power of Canadian donors. That's where you and I have to start asking questions before we make donations.
Lauren Phillips did. She's still planning to donate, just not to that charity.
Now, there are about 85,000 charities in Canada, and only a small percentage use private fundraisers. But having said that, those companies have made hundreds of millions of dollars. How do they justify the expense? Well, they put it this way, that it costs money to make money. They argue that they have the infrastructure that many smaller charities in particular don't have to launch something like a telemarketing campaign, that they can cast a wide net and they can catch some first-time donors. They say it's up to the charity to make sure that those donors continue to contribute to the charity year after year, but they say bringing them into the tent is what justifies that initial expense, Peter.
Now, you did manage to talk to some of the other charities. What are they saying?
We actually talked to a lot of charities. We're very open about the fact that they use these private companies as part of their overall fundraising effort. And I could sum it up by saying it's almost a charity version of keeping up with the Joneses. They hear that one charity's doing it, they've got a big campaign, they feel they have to do the same thing to compete for the donor dollar. But we've also talked to people who were shocked and then very uneasy when they saw the final breakdown of the numbers. And later in the broadcast tonight, you'll hear from a charity that had that experience, and we'll show you what they did about it.
All right, looking forward to it. Thanks, Dan.
I was actually interviewed for this. Shaun from CBC Radio called me up to ask me about it because I was listed as a fundraising expert with Concordia. And I explained to him at length how fundraising works. Now, the examples given in here are egregious. There's no question about it. And I know exactly what kinds of companies that they were talking to because I've had the misfortune to work not for any of them, but in one case with one of them. When I was working with the Canadian Hemophilia Society, they had a contract with a company that did telemarketing on their behalf in order to draw new donors all across the country. And this company was keeping about, basically it was costing about 80% of the funds raised to work with this company. And the reasoning was that it's okay to be spending this kind of money in order to get new donors in who will subsequently be kept on longer term. I didn't buy that. I didn't like the way they were operating. They were doing one particular thing that is completely unethical in the fundraising industry, in the professional fundraising industry, is accepting payment by commission, and they were paying their callers by commission, something that is completely unacceptable. And what really put me off, I went to Toronto to meet with their CEO to talk about the situation, went into his office, and on the wall of his office, he actually had a photo of his Swiss bank.
Oh.
Now, I couldn't believe, why would you even have that up there? I mean, I can understand that's motivating to you, but why would you bring a client in to see that? So, yes, there are organizations that are doing things that are unethical, that are, whose fundraising costs are way, way, way too high. No question about it, that's out there, that's happening. But this reporting by the CBC was completely, I think it was just completely manipulative, frankly. Yeah.
But why would they do that? I mean, I'm afraid it's easy to find either volunteers or have a group of people calling your prospects or people that donated already just to donate directly and then go directly to the foundation. I've worked, like when I just came out of high school, it was like my second job. I worked for the Kidney Foundation, and we were about like 6 people at night calling to ask for donations. It's not complicated.
So why would charities hire outside organizations to do that on their behalf? Typically, the organizations that do it are very short-staffed. The usual motivation is that 20%, that tiny percentage that they get, is massive in relation to what their needs are. Like that small amount, like in this particular case, the money that we were getting to keep was a reasonably significant chunk of the budget. I mean, it wasn't a majority of the budget, but it was an important chunk of money, the actual amount of money that we were getting to keep. And that's what drives these charities, is that they can hire a company like this, the company does all of the work for them, and they get enough money to operate with. And they don't really think about it in terms of what the donors would think about it. Now that's a problem. Yeah.
So why would you spend a lot of money with like a third party that would operate for you when you could recruit volunteers to work for free?
Or even just pay them, you would get like more money than...
Because you're not spending any money. Think about it. You're hiring a company that's coming in and they're saying, you don't have to pay us anything. We will generate this revenue. We will take our expenses out of the money that we generate, so it's not costing you anything. That's their pitch.
Yeah, but the money that's generated is for that cause. It's for the cause. Like the maximum that you could get is for the cause, not to pay people. Like, why would you want to spend, like, for them to take a token out of it? Like, it makes no sense.
Because from their perspective, they're looking at it and saying that in order to do our work, we need, we need $250,000. If they can, raise $1 million and give us the $250,000 that we need, then we can function and we can make the difference that we're here to make. right? That's their reasoning. What they're not paying attention to is that they got donors that gave $1 million who were expecting most of that $1 million to go to the cause, when in fact only 25 cents out of every dollar was going to the cause.
And then afterwards, I bet they say, let's say they raised $1 million, but in that $1 million you have $250,000 that's going to the foundation, but they still tell you that, yeah, we raised $1 million. But then you don't even know when that $1 million it's only $250 that's going to the foundation. It's like,
my question actually is in regards to what would be the ethical way of doing this actually? Because
thank you, because that's leading more towards what I want to be focusing on.
There are some companies that do it for a really small rate, and that's cheaper than hiring people. I actually have a friend who works with fundraising direct for 3 months, and the more stories that I heard from that call center was actually that working in a fundraising office, the amount of from what she told me, it sounds like they were actually losing donors because they were calling existing donors and they were alienating them.
And these companies. Now the thing is, we're talking about the worst of the worst here, and that's what the CBC was focusing on. My problem with this is the CBC is making it sound like all charities are doing this.
Yeah.
They're also, the woman that they interviewed from that watchdog organization who talked about people don't know how much, how did she word it? How much money fundraisers are skimming off the top. I'm part of that skimming off the top. And that is not what I do for a living. That is not what's driving me or motivating me. And I'm very careful about how much how much I deliver for the amount that it costs to hire me if I'm working as a, if I'm working in a consulting situation. And most professionals do. One thing stood out here, they didn't interview anybody from the Association of Fundraising Professionals, which is the largest group of professional fundraisers in the world, and including the largest one in Canada. And at the time that this was going on, the international chairperson of AFP was a Canadian. The only time that AFP has ever had a Canadian as its chair. Andrea McManus from Calgary was the international chair of the Association of Fundraising Professionals at the time. CBC could have talked to a Canadian to get authoritative information on how this works. They didn't talk to them because that didn't fit with the with the story that they, with the horror story that they wanted to deliver, which is also why Shaun Appel interviewed me twice, not on air, but just talked to me twice, and didn't use any of the content from that, because it would have drawn away from the horror stories that they were trying to highlight in this piece. With the unfortunate impact that it sends a message about how people should evaluate charities that is completely inaccurate. Which is also why I'm dressed a little bit differently than usual today. I bought this shirt specifically to wear it for this particular module of the course. Right? It says, I'm overhead. And down on the sleeve here, and it's actually oriented such that I can read it to somebody, it says, everyone wants charities to spend as little as possible on overhead. That's backwards. Overhead is what drives growth. If charities can't grow, they can't solve problems. So overhead is a good thing, and I'm overhead. I don't apologize for getting paid to raise money for charities. But I do it within ethical guidelines, and I do it paying close attention to how much it's costing. But there are it is reasonable to expect that there's going to be an amount of money that's paid in order to bring money in. That's reasonable. We want to keep it to a level that's acceptable. Which is where we're going next, is to talk about how should we evaluate charitable performance. Now, there are two sets of formulas that we're going to be talking about here. The first set comes from Greenfield. I forget his first name now. I've actually met him too. What's his name? I forget Greenfield's first name. It's embarrassing.
James.
James, thank you. Yeah, Jim Greenfield. Greenfield created the 9-point performance index, which is a fairly standard set of measures, and everybody needs to know those. After I go through Greenfield's 9 points, we're going to go into a number of additional measures that are still important to know, but just for the 220 students, you won't be tested on those. Oh, you hate being a graduate student. So, Jim Greenfield's 9-point performance index, these are the 9 points, and I'm going to go through each of them. Some of the 9 points don't actually involve calculation. The first 3 of the 9 points don't involve any calculation. And there were actually 10 things, but for some reason, the number of people solicited is one of the necessary pieces of calculation for this thing, but for some reason he didn't include it. This should have been a 10-point index. Anyway. So we start off with basic data. This is the raw material from which the calculations are done. Participants is the number of donors. So the number of people who contributed. Now, one thing about the 9-point index is that it can be applied across all of the fundraising that an organization does over the course of a year. It can also be applied to individual fundraising activities during the course of the year. So each individual direct mail campaign can be included. It could be your major gifts, your annual major gifts campaign. It could be your annual gala. You can do the analysis on each of the component parts and on the development operations as a whole on an annual basis. So participants is the number of donors. Income is the gross contributions. How much money did those donors give? Expenses is the direct cost of fundraising. So all of the costs that go into the process of doing the fundraising. And then that extra piece, which is the number solicited, is the number of prospects who received the appeal. That's necessary for some of the calculations, and particularly some of the early calculations. You need to know how many people were asked. Okay? Now we get into the calculations. And these are, particularly in the 9-point index, these are pretty intuitive. This is not complicated stuff to figure out. Percent participation is simply the proportion of those who were solicited who actually made donations. And you calculate it by dividing the number of participants, the number of donors, by the number of people who were asked for money. Really straightforward. How many people did we ask? How many of them gave? The number that gave, what proportion are they of the number of people that we asked? So here's what it might look like. As an example. Say you got 5,000 donations. After having solicited 20,000 people. So you sent out a direct mail piece to 20,000 people, 5,000 of them responded. Then the participation rate, the percent participation, is 5,000 divided by 20,000, which is 0.25 or 25%. Which is actually obvious if you think about it. If 5,000 people gave out of 20,000 people who were asked, it means 1 person in 4 made a donation, or 25%. Okay, so that's your most basic calculation. Second is average gift size. Again, totally intuitive. It's the mean contribution. You calculate your gross income, the total amount of dollars that you received, by the number of people who made donations to see what was the average gift that they gave. So say that our gross income was $34,000, and we remember from previously we had 5,000 people who gave. Then the average gift is that $34,000 divided by the 5,000 people who gave, which is $6.80. So the average gift was $6.80, which you can test it by going backwards and multiplying 6.8 by 5,000. You'll get 34,000, right? Next one is net income. Again, a basic one. It's the funds that are remaining after you deduct the fundraising expenses. So you simply subtract the fundraising expenses from the gross fundraising income. So if your fundraising expenses, if it cost you $50,000 to carry out this campaign, and you generated $34,000 in revenue, then your net income, in this case, is going to be negative, right? You're going to take your $34,000 that you generated in revenue, you're going to subtract your costs, and you find out that you lost $16,000. You So your net income in this case is negative. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing to have negative net income on a particular fundraising activity. If that, and we're going to, and I'll see when I get to the very last slide that I'm looking at this evening, you're going to see how this plays out. But it is reasonable for it to actually cost you money to attract new donors. It's called prospect fundraising, and it is not unusual for prospect fundraising to have a net cost rather than a net benefit, because it costs more to attract a new donor than it does to keep a donor you've already got. So there are two messages here. Number one, boards of directors, who are the ones who make the decisions on what money to spend, need to understand that it's not necessarily a bad thing to have a gross expense rather than gross income coming from the process of attracting new donors. The more important message is you need to be really working hard to hang on to the donors you've got, because soliciting them is always going to be less expensive than trying to attract new donors. So if you are soliciting past donors, this number should always be positive. Anytime you're soliciting from people who have already donated to your cause, you should always, in that circumstance, be making significantly more money than it's costing you. But if what you're doing is specifically trying to attract brand new donors, it is not necessarily a bad thing to have that cost you money rather than generate net revenue. But you need to budget for that. Any questions to that point? That's all. We're good? Okay. Next, now we're starting here to get into somewhat less intuitive, but still pretty simple calculations. The average cost per gift. So this is the amount that is spent in order to get each contribution. And it is calculated by dividing expenses by the number of participants. So if your fundraising expenses were $50,000 and your number of donors was 5,000 people gave, then your average cost per gift is that 50,000 divided by the 5,000 donors, which tells you that it costs you $10 to get each gift.
Like paying the person to be on the phone with them or sending them a letter. Whatever it costs to get the paper to write that letter, plus postage, plus whatever.
But what I don't agree with that number is actually because there's, in a fundraising campaign, there could be two types of activities, right? The ones that you do with capital, with the capital donors, or you can be with the donors that are less, that will be so it's still the average, but it would cost you more money technically to do, the one-on-one with the ones that give capital donations than it would from someone that gave $10 or $20.
Well, actually, it costs less to solicit higher-end donors than it does to do mass solicitation of the smaller dollar figure donors.
Really?
Yeah, really. As a function of the amount of money that's generated. Because remember, when you're doing major gift solicitation, you are probably having to pay more money for that, but you're generating massively more money.
Right.
So when you compare the massive amount of money that you raised to the amount of money that you spent, you actually find that it's a more efficient form of fundraising than trying to solicit mass numbers of people for relatively small gifts.
Yes, I understand that, and I agree, which is why I still don't understand the numbers, because...
Well, the specific numbers here don't mean anything. Okay, ignore the numbers are only intended to illustrate how the calculation is done. These are not standard numbers that I'm putting up.
Right, but the calculation would still be based on the capital donations and the lesser amount, let's call it like that. It would still take both.
I mean, the thing is, you could be doing both. You could be doing an analysis of your annual giving campaign, an analysis of your annual fundraising golf tournament, an analysis of your major gift fundraising, and then you can also be doing an analysis of everything that you're doing together so that you're getting an overall picture. So both things are being done. But the principle here is that you're calculating how much it costs you to get each of the gifts that you obtain. So so you're dividing your fundraising expenses, your total fundraising expenses, whether this is on an overall basis or on a project basis, by the number of people who gave. So essentially, it's the same thing as the average gift, except that instead of looking at the money you raised, you're looking at the money it cost. So those two figures together are, will give you a picture of what your what people gave on average, but what it cost to get them to give on average. So if you recall, the average gift was what, $6.80 here?
Yeah.
So because the average gift was smaller than the average cost per gift, again, what we're looking at here is a campaign that had a net cost rather than a net benefit. Okay, the next calculation, this is the most standard and most frequently used calculation. And in some ways that's unfortunate, which I'll talk about in a second. But what Greenfield calls cost of fundraising is typically referred to in the industry as cost per dollar raised. And cost per dollar raised is the most frequently used statistic for measuring fundraising efficiency. Definition: the amount spent in fundraising costs in order to raise $1 in gross income. How much did it cost you to raise each dollar that you got? And it's calculated very simply by dividing the fundraising cost by the gross income. So say our fundraising cost, so we're sticking with the same example here, fundraising cost of $50,000. The gross income we saw earlier was $34,000. All we're going to do is divide one by the other. The fundraising cost divided by the gross income, and we have a cost per dollar raised of $1.47. And it is typically presented as a dollar figure. So in this case, we know that each gift, each dollar cost us $1.47 to obtain. And there are some standards for that we typically use in the industry for this, which I'll get to at the end. But this is the most basic. This is the most basic calculation that's used, and it was the one that the CBC coverage was focusing on. How much did it cost to raise a given amount of money? And that's really all this measure is. But it's a standardized enough measure that you can compare across different organizations. The problem is that it's not necessarily. None of these numbers gives you a complete picture. You have to go beneath the numbers in order to understand. And it took a while for the fundraising industry to get the message across to the Canada Revenue Agency that you can't give a standardized figure for what cost per dollar raised should be. Because a brand new organization is, generally speaking, going to have higher, they're going to tend to have both higher administrative costs and higher fundraising costs as a proportion of overall expenses than organizations that are better established. And the reason for that is fairly straightforward. If you've got a brand new organization, they don't have an existing donor base, which means that all of the fundraising they're doing is prospect fundraising, which, as I've said earlier, is more expensive than raising money from your existing donor base. So a brand new organization will always have relatively higher fundraising costs and often higher administrative costs as a function of their overall budget. Similarly, smaller organizations will always tend to have higher amounts of money, proportionately higher amounts of money being spent on what's often called overhead. It shouldn't be called overhead. Overhead is a bad word to be using in the context of the voluntary sector. Overhead is something that makes sense in the manufacturing sector, where you do have costs that are over and above the cost of manufacturing. But in the service sector in general, the actual delivery of service is itself a form of, it is the manufacturing of the service sector. Whether we're talking about the restaurant sector, the hospitality sector in general, or the voluntary sector where we are, the cost of delivering services is always going to be relatively higher as a function of the revenue generated. And for smaller organizations, even more so, because every organization needs to have an executive director. Somebody's got to be in charge of the organization, right? No matter how big the organization is, there's going to be somebody who's in charge of it. So even if you have an organization that has only one staff person, and that's the executive director, well, at that point, if that's the only person being paid, and if this is if all services are being delivered by volunteers, it may be that one administrative salary may represent a massive proportion of the annual budget. But you can't have the organization without that person to, recruit the volunteers, train the volunteers, oversee the process, do all of everything needs to be done for fundraising, to manage the books, all of the things that need to be done are going to have to be done by that one person. So smaller organizations will naturally always have proportionately higher amounts being spent on fundraising and administration than very large organizations. If you look at McGill, although McGill is spending $15 million in fundraising costs, those costs are actually a relatively small proportion of the amounts of money being raised. Because McGill, being a massive, well-established organization, is able to be highly efficient in its fundraising operations, even though those operations are absolutely enormous. Okay? So, that's what I want to get across, is that you need to be very careful when you're looking at this statistic, which is, as I said, the most frequently cited statistic in fundraising efficiency. You need to be very careful to look beneath the figures to understand why those numbers are coming out. The CRA said, finally the fundraising industry got across to the CRA that they needed to move away from their standardized figure was 20%. Basically they said, if you're spending more than 20% of the funds that you've raised in receipted gifts on administration and fundraising, then we're going to investigate you. And now they're much looser on that. They realize that they've got more of a scale, and essentially they won't, it's like the alarm bells won't go off until you hit about 35%. Around 35%, so in other words, if your cost per dollar raised is more than 35 cents on an overall basis, then the CRA may pay attention. They may start to take a look, because at that point they're saying, okay, that could be problematic. Could be, but they're not automatically going to subject you to an audit. They'll take a look at it and see what the situation is. If you're below that level, generally speaking, they won't respond negatively, but you also need, as an organization, you need to be paying attention to those numbers too. Next calculation is one that's actually not all that frequently used. This is the last of Greenfield's calculations, return on investment. And it's a score expressed either as a percentage or as a dollar figure, more often as a percentage, I think, that measures how effectively fundraising investment is serving to generate income. That's a lot of words to say that what we're going to do is divide net income. Very important, we're dividing net, not gross income, but net income, by fundraising costs. So what we're saying is that for every dollar spent on fundraising, this is the amount that was raised. And then we multiply that by 100 to be able to deliver it as a percentage. So if your net income, so we did this calculation earlier, the net income was $16,000. The fundraising costs, we're using the same example, were $50,000. So the return on investment is going to be that negative $16,000. The net income was negative $16,000. It was a net cost, not net income. So it's negative $16,000 divided by $50,000, which is minus 32%. So there was a 32% loss on investment. in this particular case. This number, when it goes positive, it can go insanely positive. It can go to such insanely large numbers. Like, it is not unusual to have a return on investment that's in the thousands of percentage points. And because of that variability, this is a number that doesn't tend to get, tend to get employed in usual analysis. Cost per dollar raised is the one that gets used the most frequently. Return on investment, although it is the 9th of Greenfield's 9 points, it doesn't actually get used all that much. You still need to know how to calculate it. And the main thing is, be careful. This one is based on net income, not gross income. Okay, the next set. Now, these ones, for the 220 students, you are not being graded on the stuff. You are not going to be tested on the stuff that follows. But this is still super important. This is actually way more important stuff than the stuff in Greenfield's, than the basic calculations that Greenfield's talking about. Because these additional performance measures, most of these, I got most of these from Harvey McKinnon, he's a Canadian fundraiser from Vancouver, who speaks frequently on the fundraising circuit. And these start to get more into measuring the longer-term impact of fundraising operations. And you'll see what I mean as we start going into them. The first of McKinnon's numbers is net annual growth in donors. So what we're looking at here is the growth in the donor file when the number of new donors is compared to the number of donors lost. Every year as you're doing fundraising, you're going to bring in a certain number of new donors, and a certain number of people who donated in the past are going to stop donating, right? Pretty straightforward. What we're doing with this calculation is we're comparing those numbers and coming up with a net and a sense of the net annual growth. So we're going to count the number of donors who gave last year. We're going to count the number of those donors who gave this year. So we're comparing 2 years here. And that's the other thing here. Here we're starting to compare across years. Greenfield's measure within a single fiscal period, within a single financial year. The additional figures, most of which are coming from McKinnon, they're standard figures. I got them from McKinnon. These tend to compare over years. And if you're going to start to do a really effective job of understanding trends in fundraising, you need to be comparing over several years. So we're going to look at the number of donors who gave last year, the number of those donors who gave again this year, and we're going to subtract A from B, which will give us the gross number of lapsed donors. So this is the number of people who dropped off the list. Then we're going to count the number of new donors that we got this year. Okay, so we're going to so the different calculations we got are the people who gave last year, the people from last year who gave again this year, subtracting one from the other in order to see how many donors we lost this year, and we're going to look at the number of new donors that we picked up. And finally, we're going to add D and C. The number of new donors that we got this year is going to be added to the number of donors that we lost last year. In practice, C is going to get subtracted from D, which is going to give us our net annual growth in donors. So let's say 5,000 people gave last year. Of those 5,000 people, 3,000 of them gave this year, which means the gross number of lapsed donors is minus 2,000, right? It's 3,000 minus 5,000. That's how many people we lost. That's how many donors we lost. This number will never be greater than 0. The greatest it can possibly be is 0, for the obvious reason that you can't have lost more donors than you had in the first place. Right? So this is almost always going to be negative. Like it's a pretty rare situation that you would keep every single one of your donors. Let's say we picked up 2,500 new donors this year. So our net annual growth in donors is 500. Now, these numbers are only meaningful when you're comparing them across years. The whole purpose to this operation is to track trends over time. But in this particular case, what we're looking at, what we're starting to really analyze, is something that has been a massive concern for AFP over the course of about the last 5 years. The central focus has tended to be on developing donor retention. It was identified in research several years back that charities across the board in Canada and the United States, which is where the vast majority of AFP members are located, that donor retention rates were dropping catastrophically. That we were seeing that organizations were not hanging on to donors. And so it's been a major focus of the organization internationally to start looking at how to calculate, how to track trends, and how to hang on to the people that we've already got donating. Second of these is second gift conversion rate. The definition is the percentage of new donors who make a second gift. So once again, you see this same trend happening where we're comparing over a number of years, we're comparing over a couple of years, and we're looking at it in terms of donor retention. So what we want to do is count the donors who gave their first ever gift in year one. So we're establishing a year one baseline year, whatever year that was, whenever they gave their first gift. Then we're going to count the number of year one first-time donors, the number of these people who made a second gift, who gave again. How many of them made a second gift? Divide B by A and express it as a percentage. So, looked at numerically, if 5,000 people made their first ever gift in whatever we're using as our baseline year, and of those 5,000, 2,000 of them made a second gift. 2,000 of them gave again the following year. Then the second gift conversion rate is 40%. What it means is that 40% of the people who make first-time gifts make additional gifts. And the second gift conversion rate is a numeric measure of your donor retention. To a certain extent, it's one of the key measures of your donor retention, of your effectiveness in donor retention. I'm just going to shift gears. I'm hoping this is really good. Yeah. Let me just show you. I'm moving away from the screen for a moment, just to illustrate why this matters with a case that I actually observed. I was hired by an organization to come in, and their focus was, they said, we need to get new donors. Because they said that what's been happening over time is that if these are years and this is dollars, it's that over the years our fundraising has been staying fairly flat. We're flatlining. That's not a very good thing, right? So they were saying that basically what we figure is happening is that the same people are giving year after year, that we need to get new people to give. Right? It kind of looks like that if you look at this. Okay, so I went in, I was hired to do this, to go and find new donors, but the first thing I wanted to understand was, who are these people? What is actually happening here? Here's what I found out. Let's say that they had, this is 100% of donors in year one. Right? The following year, of those people, not okay, okay. So this is year one. In year two, of these, they kept only a very tiny proportion. But they added enough new donors to bring them back up to the same level that they had had previously. By the following year, by year three, this number had gone down to effectively 0. This number had gone down to a similar level to that one. But they had picked up enough new donors again to bring them back up to the same level. And this was happening year over year. So what was actually happening where they thought we need to find new donors. The reality was they were doing an awesome job of getting new donors. They were getting most of their donors every single year were brand new. Their problem wasn't finding new donors. Their problem was that they were doing a catastrophically bad job at hanging on to the people that had previously donated. That if they just concentrated effort on keeping these new donors that were coming in on a year-to-year basis with better donor recognition, better stewardship, then they could be massively increasing the amount of money they'd be raising on an annualized basis.
What is stewardship again?
Stewardship is it is treating donors well. It is what you do. Stewardship is what you do with donors after they've made the gift. So everything that goes into the tender, loving care of donors on an ongoing basis after they've contributed. And if you're not doing a good job at that, this is what happens. You end up with a situation where if you're in that kind of a circumstance, it's like finding new donors wasn't the issue. I knew exactly where their new donors were. They were bringing them in on an annual basis. They were all there. It was a question of concentrating effort. What they really needed to do was to concentrate effort on trying to retain the donors rather than concentrating effort on trying to find new ones. That's why these numbers matter, because these kinds of situations happen for real. And I can attest to it because this happened to me. So, we'll continue. More calculations. The net cost per new donor acquired is the amount of money to acquire one new donor. How much does it cost us to get each new donor that we bring in? What we're doing here is subtracting fundraising expenses from gross income and then dividing that by the number of new donors. So to look at this in practical terms, fundraising expenses are $50,000, the same numbers we've been looking at before. Gross income is the same $34,000 that we were looking at earlier. Then the net income is the same minus $16,000 that we saw earlier. Let's say that the new donors acquired, we'll say it was 500. The 500 new donors were acquired. So what we're going to do is divide minus 16,000 by 500 and get a cost of $32. That it was, and in this case, I'm just wondering why that. Hi. So, at this point in the presentation, I ran into a bit of a problem. Something that I put down to Friday evening dementia. I realized that I was dividing a negative number by a positive number, which normally should produce a negative outcome. But here's the thing. With this particular calculation, the outcome needs to be the absolute value of the result of the division. What that means is that whether you come up with a negative or a positive, you're still going to present it as a positive outcome because it demonstrates how much it cost you to acquire new donors. And it can't have cost you a negative amount. That would suggest that somebody was giving you money in return for new donors, which wouldn't happen. So just keep that in mind. No matter whether you had a net gain or a net loss, you're always going to present this particular outcome as a positive, no matter what the result of the calculation happens to be. Can't be negative. Okay. Donor attrition rate. This is another one that we want to focus on. At what rate are we losing donors on a year-to-year basis? So the rate at which donors fail to renew their gifts. Start by counting the number of donors in year one. So again, we're going to set a baseline year, usually 2 years back. Count the number of year one donors who gave in year two. So the similar calculation to what we had done earlier. And then divide B by A to get the donor renewal rate. And then subtract C from 100 and express it as a percentage. You'll see here that what you're going to get are two corresponding numbers that when added together are going to equal 100%. because your attrition rate and your renewal rate added together are always going to equal 100%. So if the number of donors in year 1 was 5,000, of those 5,000, 4,000 of them gave in year 2, then the renewal rate is 80%. Right? Which means that the attrition rate is 100% minus 80%, which is 20%. So those two numbers are always going to correspond. They're always going to add together to 100%. Your renewal rate and your attrition rate. And again, these are numbers that are only meaningful when looked at as a trend. So the idea is to be calculating this on an annual basis in order to see what the trend line looks like. You may be able to pick up benchmark rates as well from the industry. Blackbaud, for instance, does publish some background, some benchmark information, so you can see what other similar organizations had as results on a year-to-year basis and compare it to other organizations. Long-term donor value is the voluntary sector equivalent of what in marketing we refer to as customer lifetime value. This is the measure of gross income received from a typical donor during the entire time that that donor gives to the organization. Lifetime customer value in commercial contexts is how much money the average consumer will spend over the entire time of their relationship with the company. Same thing, so this is that same calculation, but in the context of the voluntary sector, what we want to know is how much is a new donor likely to be worth over the entire period of time that they're likely to stay with us as a donor. Now, we're going to use a quick and dirty calculation for this. This is something that, this is the kind of number that economists get all excited about and build really massive, complicated formulae around. And, it's typical of economists to just suck all the joy out of everything. We're not going to let them do that. We're going to use a quick and dirty calculation that will give us a good, reasonable approximation of what this number should be. And that involves dividing the average annual donation, which we've already calculated, by the average annual attrition rate, which we just previously calculated. Take those together and you get a good approximation of customer lifetime, of donor long-term value. So if the average annual donation is $132, let's say the average annual attrition rate is 20%. So we anticipate that we're going to lose 20% of our donors on an annual basis. Right? The rough calculation of long-term donor value based on those numbers is $660. What that means is that we anticipate that any new donor recruited at this point will, over the course of time that they remain with us, give approximately $660. Now, that starts to give a picture. At that point, you start taking a look at this kind of an outcome, where if you're losing massive numbers of donors, first of all, your average donor value is going to plummet, but you can also see how much it's costing you if you're not hanging on to donors. If you're not doing a good job of hanging on to your donors, the cost is in terms of how much you're going to lose over time. In the marketing course that I teach, there's an example in the textbook of a grocery store owner, an anecdote actually, a grocery store owner who said, when I see some new customer walk through the store and then walk out without buying anything, I see $50,000 going out the door. Because he's running a grocery store. People tend to go to the same grocery stores over and over again, and they tend to stick with them over a long period of time. So he's realizing that if I don't hang on to new people come walking in and they don't become regular customers of ours, the long-term loss, I may have lost the price of a carton of milk today, but the long-term loss is enormous. And so treating customers well every time they come in the door is something that's going to have significant long-term value to that grocery store. It's the same thing in fundraising. Every new donor that you attract, the longer you can keep them around, the more likely, the more they're going to generate over time as they stay with the organization. Next is long-term return on new donor acquisition investment. It's a big, long way of saying it's a score expressed as a percentage or dollar figure that measures the long-term impact of investing and recruiting new donors on revenue generation. So this is a number that, if you can calculate this, boards love this. Especially, if you've got finance people on a board, they get super excited about these kinds of numbers. They're the finance people are the kind of people who get excited about these kind of numbers. So what you're doing is you're going to divide the long-term donor value, the quick and dirty figure we just calculated, by the average annual net cost per new donor acquired. Earlier we calculated how much does it cost us to acquire a new donor. We're going to compare that cost to how much the donor is going to be worth over their lifetime. So, looking at how to calculate it, long-term donor value, we already calculated that as $660. The average annual net cost per new donor acquired, we had calculated that earlier, it was $32. So, the long-term return on donor acquisition investment is going to be that $660 divided by $32, which gives you, delivered as a dollar figure, is $20.63, or as a percentage, 2,063% return on investment. This is the return on your investment on bringing in new donors. And this is the kind of number you need to be able to use to demonstrate that it might be worthwhile to actually lose money on donor acquisition if you've got this kind of an income, this kind of an outcome of having brought in those new donors. Now, if you're not getting this kind of result, then investing massively and bringing in new donors might be a true waste of money. But if you are hanging on to them over time, what you're going to find is that this number ends up being, this is another one of those numbers that can rapidly become massively large, almost absurdly large. But you can see, I mean, it is obvious at a quick look how much it is worthwhile to invest in bringing in new donors, because it's only costing you $32 to bring in a donor, but those donors are giving you $660 over time. And particularly if your annual giving rate is steadily increasing, then that long-term, and if your retention rates are increasing over time or are maintained at relatively high rates, then your long-term donor value could be really significant, and your cost is going to tend to fluctuate around the same kind of level, so that you could see massive benefits from that. But this is how you justify to a board the expense that's needed in order to bring in new donors. It's also the number to take a look at to determine for yourself whether or not that investment is worthwhile. So in this case, what it means is that for every dollar spent on acquiring a new donor, you're getting $20.63 in long-term revenue. And, how many people would be willing to invest $1 in order to get nearly 21 bucks back? Does that look like a good deal? Yeah. So, if you can demonstrate this to a board, you're far more likely to get them, and if you're able to provide a board with those kinds of figures on an ongoing basis year over year, and where they can measure those trends, you're going to be in a far better position to justify the cost of fundraising. Any questions there?
Yes, $20.63 is per annum, like per year.
Per dollar raise. No, that's not annually. That's based. That's in the lifetime of the donor.
So doesn't matter whether.
Because in this case, what you're calculating is for every dollar we're spending on acquisition, how much money are we getting back over time, over the entire time the donors are staying with us. So it's the return on that $1 of investment. So the 2063 is not annual. It's, in that case, it's the total, so but it's per donor.
Yes, there is no time limit there.
No. No, because the time limit is, because you're gonna base this on, because with the quick and dirty calculation we're using, we're not actually looking at the actual amount of time that somebody stays with the company.
The focus is one person.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to finish off just by talking a little bit about reasonable cost guidelines. You say that no common standard, Greenfield says no standards currently exist. There are, and we're going to see them in a second. But it would be really hard. The problem is that for a lot of these calculations, so much depends on things like how big the organization is, how long the organization has been in business, what kinds of positive and negative environmental things are going on in a given geographic area or in a given, in a given year. That coming up with standardized guidelines is fairly difficult. You want to be doing at least the 9-point analysis for everything you're doing during the year. You also want to be doing the McKinnon, the additional analyses. To the extent that you're doing those on an annualized basis, you're going to have a much stronger, a much more complete picture of how your fundraising is performing, and a much more convincing set of statistics to be providing for a board to justify your fundraising costs. You want to be analyzing data over a minimum of 3 consecutive fiscal years. Usually about a 3 to 5 year period is what we recommend. You go back more than 5 years, the data starts to be a little stale. But if you go back less than 3 years, you don't have enough. You just don't have enough data points to be able to do a reasonable analysis, to have reliable results. But the critical thing is, don't rely just on the numbers. You have to look at what's behind the numbers as well. The numbers are there to give you an indication of what to look for in terms of the reasoning for what's going on. The numbers by themselves can't be, all by themselves, driving decision making. The last slide I'm going to look at and show you tonight is the reasonable fundraising cost guidelines. These are generally accepted in the industry as ranges that are as sort of normal ranges. For direct mail acquisition, this is prospect mailing. The standard, and these are all given in cost per dollar raised. This is, that is the most frequently used statistic. Direct mail acquisition, typically you want to be expecting a cost of $1 to $1.25 per dollar raised, which means that prospect mailing, you're pretty much expecting is going to cost you money rather than generating net revenue, that it's going to have a net cost. But that's because you're going to be able to generate more revenue over time from those donors. The idea is that if you invest in keeping those donors, you're going to get a lot more from them over time. Benefit events, standard cost per dollar raised is about 50 cents. We normally, if an event, if about 50% of the money generated from an event is going towards the cost of the event, or conversely, 50% of the money raised by the event is being made available to the organization for its use, that's considered in the industry to be a reasonable average. Which means that if you're on an overall basis going to have a healthy development program, you can't be relying entirely on events. Because if events are going to be running you, cost per dollar raised of 50 cents, the CRA is going to freak out when they look at your numbers. That you have to be doing other things. Planned giving tends to have about a 20 to 30 cent cost per dollar raised. Membership organizations, that would be things like, I think by membership organizations, we're talking in terms of things like auxiliaries of hospitals, so don't worry too much about that one. Direct mail renewal. This is a key one to take a look at. Look at the difference between direct mail renewal and direct mail acquisition. Direct mail acquisition, $1 to $1.25, you're expecting to lose money. The direct mail renewal, you're expecting that 80% of the money that you raise is going to go to the costs, too. So it's not going to be eaten up in fundraising costs. At this point in the presentation, we had a technical glitch, namely, the battery ran out on the video camera. Not a major problem because what was coming up was, in fact, the very last slide of the evening. And what we're looking at in this slide is the most efficient forms of fundraising. Essentially, anything that involves face-to-face solicitation is going to be hugely more efficient than any other kind of fundraising. The figures we're seeing here, the standard guidelines, are 10 to 20 cents per dollar raised, which means that doing this kind of fundraising, you're going to be hanging on to 80 to 90% of the funds raised over and above the cost of fundraising. And this is why when you're putting together an overall development program, it's critically important to spread out the types of fundraising you're doing and to include major gift fundraising as part of your overall strategy. Because that fundraising is so incredibly efficient, using that kind of fundraising is going to offset the more expensive forms of fundraising. For instance, one thing you don't want to be doing is depending on events to be your only source of funds, because we can see those are massively expensive, and if that's your only source of funding, then the Canada Revenue Agency is likely to notice. But if you're including major gift fundraising, two things are going to happen. First of all, it's usually efficient, as you can see, 10 to 20 cents per dollar raised. But the other thing is, it raises a lot more money than any other form of fundraising, because the individual donations are huge as compared to what you're likely to be generating from an annual appeal, and certainly from what you would be generating in the context of an event. So make sure when you're putting together an overall fundraising program that you're looking for that kind of a spread, that you've got a combination of prospect mailing or other kind of prospecting to bring in new prospects, events that both bring in new prospects and generate a certain energy to the fundraising program, an ongoing annual campaign, but also a major gifts component that's going to bring in a lot of money at very low cost. So if we're talking about a development audit for the 515 students, you want to be taking a look at how, what kinds of strategies is the organization using, and are they using the full gamut of options available to them. In the case of the 220 students who are putting together fundraising plans, keep in mind these cost guidelines and pay attention to how much it's going to cost to do the activity you're doing as compared to these guidelines. And that's it for this presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me.